If you just joined us, we'll get started in about 1 more minute. Welcome, welcome. All right, welcome in everyone. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon, the Race and Education Center, Creating Equity-Centered School Leadership for the Hunt Institute. We are thrilled to have each and every one of you in our webinar today, spending some time this afternoon with us. For those of you who don't know, the Hunt Institute, founded in 2001 by Governor James Hunt, has served as a trusted thought partner to governors, legislators, state superintendents, and practitioners to provide unbiased research, technical expertise, and learning opportunities to equip and empower educators and policymakers to become audacious champions for students. Many of those champions are on this call and yourself, but also fully represented in our panel today. So with the reputation of equity at the center of our work, we find it extremely critical to raise issues of importance around race and education, specifically creating spaces for equity. And so this afternoon, I'm thrilled to have three dynamic transracial educators on the call today. Dr. Rotunda Floyd Cooper, who's the Vice President of Education Leadership at the Wallace Foundation, Dr. Mark Anthony Gooden, who's Professor of Education Leadership at Teachers College at Columbia University, and Trisha Noyola, the CEO of Rocky Mountain Prep in Colorado. And so today we're going to be really discussing the role that school principals play in shaping a positive school environment. Our panelists today have done research that you'll hear about today on this work, specifically with I think about the Wallace Foundation, who are a key stakeholder of ours, but also really did a great job of leading some research and a report on the impact and importance of school principals in creating positive spaces for equity for students. And so we'll hear about that research as well today and hear about their on the ground lived experiences in our schools today. So with that, I will turn it over to our panelists to give some quick introductory remarks to talk about a little about their work, their organization, and their passion for doing this work. So I'll first turn it over to Dr. Floyd Cooper.
Thank you so much, Jarvis. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you're zooming in from. I'm Rotunda Floyd Cooper. I am the Vice President of Education Leadership here at the Wallace Foundation, and I'm thrilled to be able to share this platform with my colleagues and with each of you. At the Wallace Foundation, our mission is to foster equity and improvements in learning and enrichment for young people and in the arts for everyone. And among our key values here at Wallace are a belief in equity, evidence, and partnership. That is really well connected to the work that we are currently investing in our equity-centered pipeline initiative. And I look forward to sharing a bit more about that with you later. This work is very personal to me as a former principal and district leader. So I look forward to hearing from you as well as learning from each of my colleagues here on the panel.
Perfect. And Trisha, we'll turn it over to you next.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Trisha Noyola. I am the CEO of Rocky Mountain Prep. And Rocky Mountain Prep is a network of 12 incredible schools across the Denver and Aurora area. We serve kids as young as 6 weeks all the way through 12th grade. And what we really pride ourselves on doing at Rocky Mountain Prep is providing a college preparatory pathway to every single child that walks through our doors. And we have the honor and privilege of serving about 5,000 students. Personally, this work matters to me so much because I am still a teacher at heart and by trade. And the best job I ever had was being principal of an elementary school back in my home community. And so having the experience of being a teacher and a school leader and a woman of color leading that work in the community that I am from, I am most passionate about making sure that there are more people like me in our schools teaching them, leading them, and that our students are constantly seeing themselves reflected in the schools that I have the blessing to lead.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Dr. Gooden.
All right, thank you, Jarvis. As you said, I'm Mark Anthony Gooden. I am the Christian Johnson Endeavor Professor of Education Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University. Very excited to be here with you today. Thank you all for coming and having an interest in the work. I'm also co-author of 5 Practices for Equity-Focused School Leadership, and I'll be talking a little bit more about my work, which broadly focuses on culturally responsive school leadership with the focus on anti-racist leadership, and also frameworks of justice that leaders can use to support students who traditionally have been marginalized. And then last but not least, you're going to be hearing a lot about the report called A Culturally Responsive School Leadership Approach to Developing Equity-Centered Principles. And I'm very excited to be one of the co-authors on that as well. So again, welcome. Very happy to share the panel with my distinguished colleagues and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. As we dive into our round of questions, I want to set the stage for all of our participants today who are joining the call today. So thank you so much again for your time. We want to make sure that we hear from you. So we have a Q&A function on the Zoom. So in the bottom of your screen on the panel, you'll see a Q&A function. If you have any questions that you want to raise to our panelists at some point throughout the process, feel free to drop in those direct questions, and we will try our best to make sure we answer as many of your questions as possible throughout the scope of our conversation this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are. And lastly, we'll eventually be opening up the chat at some point once we get in the kind of the weeds of our conversation, so that you can engage and feel free to share any practices or any ideas or any ideas that are kind of permeating because of the responses there. So again, we will on the bottom seat, you will be able to drop in any questions you have based on the Q&A function, and the chat is actually live now. And so you should see the 5 Practices book that Dr. Gooden was referencing in your chat now. And so we'll get started. Dr. Floyd Cooper, you oversee the Wallace Foundation's Equity-Centered Pipeline Initiative, which envisions school leaders as champions for equity. What have been some of your key learnings from participating districts so far?
Thanks for the question, Jarvis. As I mentioned earlier, having been a principal myself, this work is really personal to me. And it's fantastic to be able to work here at the Wallace Foundation, where we're currently supporting 8 school districts in building evidence-based principal pipelines with the goal of developing principals who can advance each of their district's equity vision. At Wallace, because we believe that all students deserve an opportunity to succeed, we recognize that systemic educational inequities can cause some barriers to not just learning, but also to opportunity and access to many students. At Wallace, we see leaders of schools, our nation's principals, as uniquely positioned to address key factors that perpetuate those inequities. And over the last 20 years with research, we've been able to confirm that effective principals have a positive and strong impact on students in schools. We've learned through that previous work and continue to see evidence of this in our current work with this Equity-Centered Pipeline Initiative, that the development of effective school principals requires intentionality and coordination and effort by districts as well as their partners. The same is true for these districts that take up the work and the challenge of designing these equity-centered pipelines. The Pipeline Initiative seeks to answer the question, how can districts develop principal pipelines that produce equity-centered leaders who advance their district's equity vision? And what we're learning as a result of this work is that equity is highly contextualized. We are also learning that in the midst of what is an extremely polarizing context, many districts are taking up the challenge of working to intentionally diversify their leadership pipelines. And something else that we're learning is that being intentional in the development of strategic partnerships, both internal and external to their communities, is critical to enacting the work successfully and will undoubtedly play a key role in the sustainability of this important work as they move forward. As a part of Wallace's commitment to this work, we've made investments in research projects that also will support the field we believe in learning about this work. 3 research studies in particular I want to highlight are one, which is an organizational and historical approach of school districts that are developing pipelines, which is a qualitative study on how the districts participating in their culture, history, leadership, and organizational structures shape their approach to developing equity-centered leaders. We are also engaged in an implementation study documenting what changes districts will make to their current pipeline work and examining the why and how of the work that they are engaging in. And we also hope to be able to develop, as a part of this research, a tool to document a measurement of equity-centered leadership. And then lastly, as a part of one of our research studies, we are exploring the research use and coordination that documents how research-based evidence and tools can productively inform districts' efforts to develop these equity-centered pipelines. Because we are midway through the work of this initiative, we look forward to being able to share more concrete findings of these studies in the year ahead.
So much. And Dr. Gooden, you co-authored, right, a culturally responsive school leadership approach developing equity-centered principles, consideration for principal pipelines with the Wallace Foundation. So can you give us a brief summary of the report and where the work stands, where the impact has been so far?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jarvis. So one thing I want to share up front is just a little bit about the background of how we came to put together this report. And I should certainly share with you that the report is based on findings from a longer lit review that is currently, we're actually revisiting that and revising and updating with three of the authors on the report. So the report includes a really use of an existing research framework, particularly the culturally responsive school leadership framework, one in which I co-authored with Muhammad Khalifa and James Davis. So you'll be hearing a little bit more about that as I talk through the study and then the conversation today. But CRSL, or as I like to shorten it, which is culturally responsive school leadership, really has 4 tenets or 4 approaches. And so all of the co-authors in that study with me, we had a chance to work on at least one of the pipelines and look at how it connects with the culturally responsive school leadership framework and to search the literature to find those connections. So the findings of the review revealed to us that some areas had limited research, which is no surprise, right? So we suggested ways to think about expanding the thinking around this work. And so we came up with this concept, this idea of theorizing forward. So in some places, there was more evidence, for example, when you start to think about the domain of principal preparation, for instance, people had done work on social justice and started to think more about it. But in other places, we found that there was a little less research. And so we had to come up with a concept, and that was we wanted to theorize forward to suggest what the literature might consider doing and what the field might consider doing in the context of what wasn't there. So I just wanted to certainly give just a little bit of a background, just some more on the culturally responsive school leadership framework. It's from an article that we published in 2016, and some relevant questions there included things like, certainly you'll hear again, that education leadership still influences the lives of students. You've seen and heard Wallace research that confirms that. No leader is an island and should certainly include others in the leadership process. Once again, you hear connections about how principals can really start to, and the report certainly suggested as much, think about this framework in the context of critical consciousness, for instance. And that's this idea of reflecting on one's social identities and thinking about how they can apply to the larger system, and how do we move it toward a space of change in that system. But often there's this thing about, we know we don't want a situation where there's this sort of great man theory of the one leader, but we recognize is that things like critical consciousness must start with the leader, even though we want them to quickly expand to, for example, like an equity leadership team. So questions like, what are the unique characteristics of a culturally responsive school leader came up again, and how can those leaders be especially responsive to the needs of minoritized students? So very much a connection to what you just heard Dr. Floyd Cooper say. Very excited to hear about what's happening in the research. And then I can go certainly on and on, but just to close with a summary, critical consciousness is the first tenet of CRSL that we really look at in the report to map onto the pipelines. But we also move into conversations about critically responsive instructional leadership, which is the second tenet. And then we move around into this idea of inclusive school environments. What does it mean to create a welcoming environment where students can come in and feel as if they can be who they are in terms of their social identities, and be welcome in an environment that will also create a commitment to supporting them and not excluding them from that space. And then last but not least, culturally responsive leadership engagement in the community context. How do we start to think about those pipelines, the domains specifically, when we're looking at culturally responsive school leadership? So I won't go through all of the pipelines with you. I've mentioned one, but another one is leader standards, selective hiring and placement. So just think about, what would it mean if we had folks go into a space being aware of inequities, historical inequities, and start to think about how we are going to selectively hire people and place them in positions, especially given the broader context of how these historical and structural inequities have impacted our lives and our school systems.
Thank you so much for that response. And it's such a perfect segue to Tricia, as someone who I know has been extremely intentional with your hiring, particularly women of color in prominent positions throughout your school leadership of everywhere you've worked, as a principal, as a district leader, and now the CEO. So what are steps that you are taking, have taken, to create a more equitable school system? And how has your experience influenced your passion to lead so equitably?
Thank you, Jarvis. You know, the only reason why I'm here in the position that I'm here today is because, you know, as a kid growing up on the border, I didn't see a lot of examples of people like me doing jobs like this, but I had the incredible blessing of having a strong Latina mentor who saw something in me that I did not see in myself. And she made it her business to invest in me and speak to me about the potential that I had to be a leader. And that experience fundamentally transformed who I became as a human and what I decided to do with my life. And that experience showed me that a lot of what is broken right now in education in terms of getting representation of our children in positions of power is in fact the pipeline. You know, the experience that I had of someone mentoring me, you know, selecting me and investing in me is still all too rare in 2024. And having gone through that experience, I began to see that my unique role wasn't just leading my school or leading my region, but it was in fact having the eye for talent that many of our traditional systems and structures overlook. And so you're right, throughout the course of my career, I have really prided myself on finding particularly women who are not the first to get asked and who often aren't raising their hand for leadership positions. And to make sure that oftentimes this might be the first time that they're hearing, you are a leader in education, you are exactly what our children need, and I'm going to do it alongside you. And then you're going to take off and you're going to do incredible things. And so I think that, you know, one of the most simplest things that we often overlook is, one, we actually need to be investing in particularly our folks that are the most underrepresented in district leadership. And right now it is women of color, particularly Latinas are the most underrepresented in superintendencies across the nation as we look at what we actually represent in school populations. And two, you know, what we're doing at Rocky Mountain Prep is I really pride myself on having a system where so many of our students can look at the leaders and see themselves in the leadership. So right now, for example, at our Creekside campus, where, if you watch the news, in Denver, in terms of the migrant crisis, we have the largest amount of newcomers, and the principal of that school was in fact a newcomer to this country herself. And what she has been able to do with those students, with those families, is transformative. And she is someone who did not raise her hand for principalship and had actually been told in previous iterations she wasn't necessarily leadership material. And so I think having experienced it in my own life and seen this again and again and again, that our pipelines are fundamentally broken, but those problems can only be fixed by more people like me entering those pipelines, coming through them, and then saying it's not enough to have right now one Latina in the entire city of Denver leading a system of schools. In fact, it should be most of us.
Thank you so much for that, Trisha, and for your experience. I just dropped the link so you can take a look about some of the work that she's been doing at Rocky Mountain Prep. Dr. Floyd Cooper, coming back to you here, as we think about the pipeline and once principals are actually in those seats, what are the best methods for actually developing culturally comprehensive training for principal development?
Thanks again, Jarvis. I just want to say how inspired I am by Trisha's story and how this is really well connected to what Dr. Gooden has been speaking about and reflects actively in his research. As we think about this idea of culturally responsive training to develop principles, I think there are many factors that we should keep top of mind, but I'll start with a few that I think are most important for consideration. This idea of understanding cultural diversity and developing critical consciousness that Dr. Gooden referenced before, I think is extremely important. Principals should have the capacity to recognize and understand the cultural backgrounds, values, beliefs, and experiences of the students that they serve, the communities that they serve, but we also must be attentive to their unique experiences and backgrounds. They also must have an understanding of the historical oppression that impacts our education systems today in order for them to support this achievement of equity as we look ahead. Additionally, I think it's important to ensure that training promotes equity, inclusivity, and diversity in leadership practices and the decision-making processes that we want to develop the capacity of principals to lead with. This is important because it builds the capacity of leaders to consider how they will also then support their teams, including teachers, in developing culturally responsive classrooms. I love that Dr. Gooden elevated this idea of community engagement. I think the fostering of partnerships with local communities and stakeholders to create a training environment that reflects the cultural context is critical. And then I think I will close with my support and echoing of what Trisha mentioned in terms of this idea of establishing principal and leader support systems. It is extremely important that we establish support systems as well as resources for principals to navigate the challenges related to cultural responsiveness and diversity that promotes inclusivity and equitable practices in this space. I cannot underscore the importance of establishing principal and leader support systems to be able to advance this work. Without the mentorship that Trisha's referred to, the support ongoing for our principals, this work cannot be achieved or realized.
Thank you so much. And I want to ask an audience question from Mr. Hughes here to you, Dr. Gooden. Thinking about those challenges, thinking about the importance that Trisha was talking about of having those people in the room, and what Dr. Floyd Cooper was talking about those very real challenges that their principals need to be there to get supported, to get trained, to do the work. How do we socialize this work within our school districts when there's already a hesitancy for things like culturally responsive teaching and leadership and those equity initiatives that already exist? So how do we kind of frame the conversation, and how do we kind of balance those challenges that we're facing on a more political landscape on the day-to-day work of school districts and the training that we know schools and teachers need, principals need?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Jarvis, for the question. So key, right? One thing I will say, I'm certainly respectful that districts will have their own definition of equity, and it will certainly be something that's specific to their context. I have, however, believe that that definition would definitely intersect with some of the content that we've said today. So I want people to understand that it's not going to be just, 10 districts will have 10 definitions of equity that are all just all over the place, right? And so what you've heard from Dr. Floyd Cooper and what you've heard from Tricia, there are some definite intersections. So in the report, we give a definition of equity. I'm just going to give this to you, and then I'm going to go back to what you've just said. So educational equity happens when each student learns and flourishes in a welcoming, caring, and inclusive environment. It requires a commitment to fair and just treatment of each student. And we thought a lot about this each student. We didn't want it to be every student. We wanted to be in the mindset of thinking about individualized support, thinking about like IEPs, if you will, for a moment. Each student, right? Not every kind of also, no, each student. That means you have some understanding of what their context is, what's going on with them in terms of how they feel, whether they're welcome in your context. And so to continue the definition, it's a willingness to address structural barriers to their success and the delivery of resources aimed at providing equitable outcomes. Now, I've heard resistance from people in different pockets of the country who have a major issue with this idea of providing equitable outcomes. And they can ask me questions like, are you trying to equalize it for everybody? And I say, well, what's so wrong with that being the goal, right? To try to get equitable outcomes for everybody. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it about me that believes I need to be in a space that's so competitive that I have to be able to point to a certain number of losers who must be on the end where they can't get equitable outcomes? So that's a very, very personal thing. And I think people get into that space, as Dr. Floyd Cooper said, by going very deep into their social identities, recognizing the context in which we have a country that has a history of embracing a racial hierarchy. And it didn't go anywhere, right? It's just like Tricia was saying earlier, something's wrong when we have a state like Denver with a large number of Latinx children there to say we have one Latinx leader in a principalship. Something's wrong with that, right? Something is wrong with that. And so if we don't know the stats from NCES, National Center for Education Statistics, just consider the context. 77% principals right now are white. 78% of teachers are still white. The majority of students in US public schools are students of color. Demographers have been telling us that for at least 15 or 20 years, that this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. And on top of that, I was at AACT just recently, and they were saying how it's even getting harder, as Tricia noted, to get people of color to go into education because they're not receiving the tap on the shoulder, they're not receiving the encouragement, and they're not being told that there's a larger mission for you to do this work. And so we have to really get to the context of what that means. So in the context of a political climate, we've got to look at those numbers and say, we're not saying all white principals are not going to be able to support students of color, but what we're saying is, because of how our country is structured, we know this to be true. Because race and culture have historically mattered, we have a cultural mismatch of experiences, perspectives, et cetera. For example, many of those teachers and leaders who attended de facto segregated schools and or segregated academic programs feel less comfortable engaging with students of color. That's just a fact of life. Many of our prep programs are still, even though they're getting better, are still a little bit anxious and shy about dealing with racial and cultural issues. And so they don't teach them as thoroughly as we would want them to, even though we're getting better. And so if those are the realities, and coupling that what you've just heard from Dr. Floyd Cooper and Tricia, we have this real serious thing that we have to kind of say. Politically, yes, we know you don't want to hear about that, but good leadership has to somewhere say, we've got to bring these folks into the fold because they're doing phenomenal work. And I would love to hear more about the principle that Tricia just said, to have give even speeches to let folks know, here's how my experience resonates with my students. And that's why when I stand up and authentically share my story in a way that's critically conscious, it resonates with students and it motivates them. It inspires them to even think about doing what I'm doing one day. And so that to me is what we have to think about doing, and do it, not think, but act on it.
Absolutely. That really resonates so well with me, and I think as well as the Institute in general, as part of the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, are aiming to get 1 million teachers of color and 30,000 leaders of color by 2030. So think about 6 years, 5.5 years to do so. but certainly an ambitious goal. But just everything everyone said so far on the panel really hits at the importance of that. And you noted something along the lines of just not only the challenges in terms of the numbers and the scope of the numbers, the disproportionality of misrepresentation, frankly. Trisha, something that I think about that you kind of alluded to in terms of like your rationale in the folks not being tapped, for lack of better words, not getting that shoulder tap, our term that we get from new leaders, to be in leadership positions. What difficulties do principals and school leaders of color face when they're actively trying to create change in their school systems, or especially around equity, that perhaps their white counterparts might not face?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one because there's about a million different things we could talk about. But I think I want to zero in on an additional layer of pressure that leaders of color face that white leaders simply do not. When I'll speak to my own experience, when I became principal in the community that I was from, and I was leading a school that was at that time fundamentally failing, the amount of personal pressure that I faced to do that job and to do that job really well was not the same as a white leader was facing in a different community. They were not from that community. They came with a very different intention. I was coming back home to my people in my mind to right a wrong that had been done to our kids. And so it's a beautiful thing, right? That's the way that we want that system to work. But what oftentimes we as the education establishment fail to acknowledge or understand is the amount of intense emotional baggage you carry on a day-to-day basis, being charged with that. So when I would make a mistake, that would be a very typical principal mistake for most people, the weight of that mistake would hit me like 10 tons of bricks. And the amount of feedback or criticism that I would get would not be just about, you actually didn't do a very good job at that. The criticism very quickly for leaders of color, particularly women, turns incredibly personal. And it becomes not just about the job or the job that you are doing, but fundamentally who you are as a person and as a human. And this is not to say anyone who works in school leadership has an easy job. It's never easy, no matter who you are. But I can tell you, when I'm in gatherings even now with my peers, the women of color have very different stories about what we have faced and what we have experienced, and the amount of criticism and the spotlight that is shined on you. And so what I'd encourage us all to do is, one, to understand that fundamentally that job that we are asking that leader to do, if they are a leader of color, particularly if they are from that community or they identify with that community, is absolutely a different job. And the stick by which they will be measured and the amount of attention, those mistakes or shortcomings that you will inevitably make, because all leaders do, are going to get, can just be insurmountable. I always tell people it wasn't the job that I have found difficult. The job in and of itself has actually been wonderful, no matter whether I've been principaling or CEOing. It is the pressure and the feedback and the amount of criticism that actually has nothing to do with the job that you did that can make this not tenable. And so, back to what we're talking about with support networks is crucially important. And there has to be a movement that is actively working against that. So we need more people in our funding communities. We need more people on school boards. We need more people in positions of power who actually understand what that is like, and who can help create safer environments. There was data that came out just today that of, all women, particularly women of color right now, who are serving in superintendency or CEO roles, 7 of 10 of us think about leaving every single day. That's not tenable, and we would never accept that for any other type of job. And so until we change the ecosystems around us to be more supportive of people like me taking these jobs, we're going to continue to see the lack of representation.
And very closely tied to that, Dr. Floyd Cooper, to Trish's point around those communities, how can school leaders connect with and learn from one another and form a community, not just within schools, but within our funding communities, particularly, as well as our business and business, other corporations, our nonprofit spaces. Yeah, how can we all come together to connect, to be a community for each other, and ultimately form more inclusive school systems?
Yeah, I think that is a really important question for us to consider. And I know as we think about this dialogue, we really are centering it on principles, but what's not lost on me is the importance of systems and the leaders of systems in support of our principles. So as I think about this idea of leaders connecting to learn from one another and to form communities, to build better schools, I think it's really important for systems to promote networking and collaboration amongst school leaders. The stories that Trisha has mentioned are sadly all too common, but I think there is power in unifying the voices of leaders. They can network and collaborate with one another to share best practices, to share resources and strategies for promoting equity in their schools and inclusivity in their schools. I think that building of relationships with other school leaders allows not only for exchange of ideas, but also exchange of experiences that can inform and inspire more inclusive practices and more inclusive environments. I also think that there is something that's important about creating specific professional learning communities and making space for leaders to be able to engage in them. They can participate in, as well as advocate to establish professional learning communities that are focused in these very specific areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, I think these spaces create an opportunity for leaders to engage in dialogue, share insights, and collaborate on common initiatives to create more inclusive and equitable school environments. I think we cannot underestimate how valuable communities and the voices of communities and partners are to advancing this important work. So promoting and prioritizing community engagements as school leaders, as well as system leaders, engage with families, community organizations, and local stakeholders to build a community-wide commitment to this work of equity and inclusion is central. And I think by involving the broader community in these conversations, leaders can promote sustainability of this work as well as initiating and advancing this work.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to take a question from Esther, who posed a question. We're going to get more, I would say, on the student side. And this, anyone can take this question on the panel. How do you recommend that schools get to the problem of individual, implicit, and unconscious bias, considering that schools aren't always designed for students of color, right? And how schools are working to redefine themselves toward inclusivity when those systems are resistant to change. So balancing that resistance to change on a systematic level with the need to get to the root cause of implicit and unconscious bias. And so would love to hear anyone on the panel's thoughts on that.
Happy to jump in and start it off if you all are good with that. Okay. So I'll just say I would certainly argue, once again referencing 5 practices for equity focused school leadership, we suggest that leaders go through ways of reflecting on their different aspects of social identity, starting with race. And there is a reason why we start with race, right? But we talk about your identity around religion, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. And our rationale for doing that is so leaders really get an understanding of where there's vulnerability on their part, and then where there's also deeper learning that they need to go into what they may not know, right? And the other thing that we suggest is working with an equity leadership team to really get this, really tap into the strengths of the folks around you who are going to help you think differently about leadership. But ultimately, we would love for that leader to share the results of that work around social identity with folks on the staff, right? So they can be inspired to do a similar thing. And what we hear from folks is this is a part of their story. This is a part of the American story, if you will. And these are the things that we don't talk about enough, but folks can point out racial inequities. People can point out the inequities that we're discussing, that we're discussing here in this dialogue. However, when it comes to, can we have a conversation about it? That's what folks really say, nah, this is going to be, some folks are going to be offended. I'm afraid somebody's going to call me a racist. And so we really try to go through, what does it mean to structure a conversation like that in a school where we're talking about data together? And then that's the last point I make, is there needs to be some type of needs assessment around the work. There's an old saying that people don't argue with their own data. I suggest that leaders, and when I say leaders, that doesn't mean the principal needs to lead this. Principal can point out a leader or somebody who might be really proficient with working with data, to go through and talk about what are the data in our schools and what do they say to us? Do we have disproportionality around suspension? Do we have disproportionality on particular access to certain aspects of the curriculum? And by looking at our own data and talking through that as a group, then there's a question of, why is it like that? Is it something about our personal beliefs? Is it something about how we come to the world and think that certain students should be in certain classes and certain students should be systematically excluded? And if we don't believe that, why is it that our data show us that reality? And so I think those kinds of conversations are guided in ways that support folks in their learning, also capture people, I say support people in their learning, also help folks understand that these difficult conversations, there are going to be mistakes, right? Stop saying we're not going to talk about that because we're going to be offended or somebody's going to, you have to give people grace if you want to move forward and move this conversation forward. And you have to give yourself grace and just say, I'm going to be the first to make a mistake. I'm going to be the first to reveal my racial autobiography or my racial reflection to you, because I'm not a perfect person. But we're not going to really address this by being timid and then watching it on the 6 o'clock news saying, well, maybe we can talk about this story, not that story. And we're certainly not going to elevate this to deal with systemic inequities. And I want to be clear, talking about our social inequities is a start. That is not the end. We don't vote folks say we talked about our identities and then when we look at our needs assessment, our equity audit, and 2 years later nothing had changed, then we have not made progress. And so we want to make sure that this is aimed toward making progress to support those kids, all of our children especially, but certainly those who have been the most marginalized in our systems.
I think one thing I'll know, I see another question in the chat here around data for impact and retention of school leaders on staff retention and student academic performance. Something that we measure, we can certainly get this data to you as well, is a major indicator of staff retention for teachers of color specifically is having a leader of color as well, right? And so that's something that we definitely see a strong correlation in. So when Tricia was talking about it, Dr. Gooden and Dr. Cooper were talking about it, yeah, the data is very clear. You think about the impact of students of color with teachers of color, that translates up on every level. And so even at the CEO superintendent level, you'll see higher rates of principalship retention because they have someone who reflects their background as well. So we can certainly get that data along to you as well as part of the key takeaways. And so another question is, I'll post this for all our panelists here. And again, feel free as we kind of come to a close the next 15 minutes or so. If you have any burning questions that you want to raise with our panelists, feel free to drop those in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to raise those questions as well. But as we think about our school leaders and we think about the need and we think about the context that we're in, how do we make the case for equity-based school leadership a bipartisan issue? Be very interested to hear y'all's thoughts on how to make this a bipartisan issue, given we're heading to election season. We know these things are under the microscope. How do we make the case for it?
I'll start us off, Jarvis, if that's okay with the group. I think this is a complex issue that many of the districts that we are collaborating with in this initiative are being challenged with, but this idea of ensuring that equity-based school leadership is a bipartisan issue, involves promoting shared understanding and commitment to education equity across parties and across ideologies. So if the focus begins to shift towards shared values, this emphasis on the shared value of fairness, justice, as Dr. Gooden talked about, and the opportunity in education, I think that can begin to transcend some political divides, and framing equity as a fundamental principle that benefits every student, all students, and contributes to the overall success of education systems, I think is important. I love that we have both researchers here as well as practitioners. So the elevation of data from schools themselves, as well as elevating research, I think is critical in making this a bipartisan issue. The presentation of evidence-based research and data that demonstrate the positive impact of equity-based school leadership on student outcomes is what many people are interested in. And this has implications, we know, for the overall performance of our schools. And then again, the engagement of stakeholders is really a strategic move that I think can make this a bipartisan issue. So bringing together diverse stakeholders, including policymakers, educators, parents, community members, other advocacy groups to collaborate, to advocate for equity-based school leadership, I think is important, and as is an approach that can be used to foster both dialogue as well as partnership that transcends political affiliation.
Absolutely. Go, Tricia.
Yeah, Jarvis, I was gonna say, I may say something not very popular, but that certainly wouldn't be a first for me. That would just be a normal day. I think having the experience of coming from Texas, that's where I'm from. And so, that is a very unique environment. What really surprises people when I talk to the folks here in particularly Denver, where, words like DEI, culture, these are actually very popular. And I think that actually presents a different sort of challenge. But I always tell people from my work in Texas, I worked with so many people who were incredibly committed to equity and equitable outcomes for children and getting more people like me in the seat. And it is not necessarily the people who you might think would be very committed to that. Now, did they use all the terms we're using on this call? No, absolutely not. Would they have described it that way? No, absolutely not. But I can tell you some of the first people who rose their hand for me to invest in me, to invest in Rocky Mountain Prep, to champion me, in many cases are not the people who you would think would do that. I think part of what is really frustrating about America today is because we are so polarized, there is a fixation on words and language, sometimes to the detriment of actually agreeing on the outcome that we can all agree on. And I have worked with many, because I had to, because I lived in Texas, many very conservative folks who were just as excited to get great outcomes for my community as I was. And so I don't think we're ever going to get to the place where we're all going to collectively agree on the same definition of equity, or we're all going to share in the same values. But I do think there are groups of people who we could bring along and who we could get there. We may just have to be more open-minded on the language that we choose to use, or how we're going to choose to find those commonalities. Now, people who wish to do my children harm, or obviously, like, that's not the folks who I am talking about. But I do wonder if part of the polarized nature of where we are as a country right now means there are actually a lot of people who agree, but maybe are just calling it something else or talking about it in a different way.
Yeah, I think those are fantastic answers. I'll just add just a feature of the work is this notion about culturally responsive pedagogy. Certainly giving students space to lead this work. And I just, just a quick anecdote that supports what my co-panelists have said is, keeping in mind that students can also be very powerful in carrying these messages forward. Just having worked with some students who were fired up about DEI work, who were leading that work themselves. I actually worked in a district where I had the wisdom with working with some people there to say, we should let the students lead these table topics. And there were folks coming in who were like anti-DEI, but when they heard students talk with passion, speak adroitly about what their future was going to be and what it meant to be a citizen, they were hearing their kids, not me. It's not Mark Gooden. I'm too old to be worrying about me. It's the kids, right? So we sometimes forget these notions around student-led projects, around their action research and their passion and what they want for their future. And they were very articulate to say, we want this. This isn't about you adults fighting, but this is about us envisioning a future that has a broad range of people from different backgrounds. And I love when they threw in the term, what does the question, what does it mean to be a global citizen in a world that we know has become more racially and culturally and all kinds of types of diversity, more diverse in terms of students. So that student voice is a very powerful thing that we should oftentimes stand back and just watch them work and then take over the conversations in I think the best possible ways.
Absolutely. Such a great point. And everything you said, all three of you said, frankly, is aligned to what we're seeing in our institute, where we work in a bipartisan manner. And we're actually planning in Delaware, an educator diversity summit. There's going to be a bipartisan summit on educator diversity with legislators at the table, right, in an election year, right? And so there are people, and we're doing another task force for ed diversity in Illinois, bipartisan, during election season, right? And so we are seeing consistently legislators on both sides of the aisle that you might not think that are there, but to Tricia's point, there are folks in these rooms behind the scenes who are doing the work to advance educator diversity. They just might call it something a little bit different. And so the investments, whether it's for your own programs in Texas, it's just multi-millions of dollars that are being invested to diversify our educator workforce and our leader workforce. The money's there, the support's there. I think sometimes it's in our framing. And so in our last couple of minutes, I'll ask one question for all three of you, a little more lighthearted in nature. What's one quality an equitable school leader should embody? You might describe yourself, because I know you all are have been equitable school leaders in your careers. But for you, what's one quality an equitable school leader should embody? We'll start with you, Dr. Floyd Cooper.
Sure. I'm happy to share, and I'm going to break the rule and share two. I think they're well connected. One quality that I think an equitable school leader to 1.1 is empathy coupled with courage. I think that those are critically important. School leaders that possess empathy and courage can consider the needs and perspectives of this diverse student population that we have been reflecting on through this last hour to support the development of both policy and practice that can promote inclusive learning environments. I think it also requires empathy and courage to build relationships that are meaningful with the students that you serve, the staff and the families that you serve, as well as the community that may be unlike your own. A willingness to take time to listen and understand and support individuals and students from different backgrounds and experience requires both empathy and courage. And then I will add that I think that the possession of empathy and courage as a leader supports addressing bias and discrimination, something that is central to the work of an equity-centered leader. And when these situations exist within our school environments and a leader has those qualities, they will work to address the issues and create safe and welcoming spaces, not just for students, but for all members of the school community.
Tricia.
I wish I was going to say something really deep and poignant, but I probably won't. The first thing that came to my mind is joy. I'm a turnaround leader by trade. That's how I was trained and came up in the system. And, one of the first things I learned really early on is how difficult of a choice optimism actually is. We have this, idea, particularly now in America, that optimism is a really easy choice, that it's an ignorant choice, that in fact it is, rainbows and puppies and very easy. And I have found it, particularly as a school leader and school systems leader, to be the most difficult choice that we make on a day-to-day basis, is to choose optimism, and within that, to choose joy. Part of what I really want to do, and what I want all of us as educators to do, is to make the field of education attractive again, to embody the joy, the excitement that really attracted me to the profession and keeps me here. And, I can't blame a lot of young people now that, look at a lot of us who appear to be miserable and hating our lives and thinking, yeah, I don't really want to do that. And so I think in terms of being effective as an equity-centered leader and just as a leader in education in America today, it is joy. It is about choosing optimism. It is about looking for the wins, capitalizing on them, evangelizing the incredible work that your kids and families are doing, and about the absolute dogged refusal to give that up. And real joy comes from that celebration that you feel, that incredible euphoria. I've never felt anything like it, of seeing our kids and our families and our leaders be successful. And what I would argue is that's not a soft choice. That is not an easy choice. That is, in fact, the choice. And I believe that hopefully, if I'm doing that on a daily basis, I'm not only paving the way and showing the example for the leaders that are going to come after me, but I am also, illustrating for my own 4 kids at home why this work matters so much. And why this is not a job that I've chosen, but this is a vocation, this is a way of life. And there's truly nothing else that I'd rather be doing.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Gooden.
Trisha, I think that was very profound. All right, I think once again, I'm in total agreement with what I've heard. I'll just add a couple of things. And you alluded to this a little bit earlier, Jarvis and Trisha and Dr. Floyd Cooper as well. Because we know when people hear this work, some folks, they come to it with a divisive mindset. They come to it ready to fight, right? And so I like to flip that on its head and play around with these two things that sometimes is surprising for folks. So in classes and in workshops, and I'm trying to do this better in my writing, it's this idea of certainly we need to be humble as we come to the work, but this is serious work, and I don't think it's minimized when we bring some humor to the work. We connect with our humanity, and people are so surprised that we can talk about these difficult topics and then still appreciate each other and enjoy each other. And so I think that that's something that I've thought about over the years. I've sort of grown into this space. I kind of have a serious face by, just by default. So I have to work on smiling when I go into these spaces, because I want people to know that even though in your heart you may think that I'm very anxious about this, and it comes out in a very divisive and almost like an aggressive, attacking way, the counter to that is to let folks know this is serious work, but we've got to connect as human beings if we're ever going to move it forward. And I found, ironically, for sometimes surprising how much humor gets at where people are, and then people are walking away surprised that we're talking about the serious topic, and I'm going to do something about it, and I'm going to go in and connect to people's humanity and say, we can laugh about some of these things that are serious, and then go in and seriously work to change them. And it's just, I think, a way of working that we sometimes forget.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I just dropped a link to the PSA that we worked on, as well as teach.org and the U.S. Partner Education that launched last November, that really helps to rebrand the teaching profession. But thank you so much to Dr. Floyd Cooper, Tricia, Dr. Gooden. Your insights have been truly incredible. We will try to capture as profound as possible in our writing a recap of your incredible responses, as well as share the recording to all who have registered as well. So you'll be getting that in the coming weeks. I also want to be remiss about plugging 2 upcoming webinars we have focused on women in education. So our K-12 team has one in 2 days called Shattering the Glass Ceilings, Illuminating the Path to Gender Equity in Educating Leadership. That's on Thursday at 2 p.m. And then next week, our team will be hosting one specifically focused on celebrating women of color in education leadership. So you'll see that on LinkedIn as well as your emails. We'd be very grateful if you register for those as well and checked out some additional great panelists. But please join me in thanking our 3 incredible panelists and yourselves today for your participation. Have a fantastic afternoon or evening, and we will see you at the next one. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Adios, muchas gracias.
Bye-bye. Thank you all for coming.